Hi there. My name is Dr. Ryan Smith, and you are joining me today for a conversation about nurturing your marriage during COVID. So during this weird window of time that we've been experiencing for the last 3 months or so. To give you just a couple seconds of background. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I've been in this profession for a while. I've run a number of family clinics. And currently, I serve in a family ministry capacity at a church in Rockwall. I've worked with thousands of couples over the years in marital crisis in all forms and fashions. Specifically over the last 3 months, I've continued to do marriage work and continue to do counseling therapeutic work with individuals as well. And have seen some things and some trends that have developed. But just as importantly to our conversation this morning, I'm a husband and I'm the father of 2 young sons. This window that we've all experienced has challenged me in ways, not just professionally, but personally, that I could never have imagined otherwise. So with that as a platform, we're going to dive in today to the idea that you can nurture your marriage and you can grow your marriage even in the midst of a pandemic and even in the midst of what seems like total and utter chaos at times. So that's what we're going to try to do today. This is an interesting conversation because things have never been more interesting in the family world. I'm using interesting because it's the least judgmental. It was a word that kind of described what we're going through without putting a positive or negative spin on it. The world has just changed in a massive, massive way. No one's family looks today the same way it did in February. That's a unique experience. In my career, I don't know that there's ever been a window of time where that's really been true the way it is now. No one's marriage looks the same either. In a marriage, like in a family, we get into routines and we get into rhythms. We are by our very nature very routine oriented. We seek structure and we seek predictability because in that structure and in that predictability, there's a sense of calm. Here's a fun fact for you that you may not know and that might surprise you. When we measure clinical levels of happiness, the people with the highest clinical measures of happiness are often people with incredibly predictable routines. It's not like the spontaneous dude who packs it up and goes into the mountains for a week to just commune. Like that's, in our minds, not being encumbered by a predictable schedule, I think is what we equate with freedom and we equate freedom with happiness. And so it may surprise us to learn that that's not generally who scores the highest on happiness scales. On happiness scales, it's people with predictability and people with structured routines. Now don't get me wrong, spontaneity in life, just like spontaneity in marriage, is essential. And I'm not asking you to do away with your spontaneity. It just doesn't have the impact on our overall happiness that we sometimes think that it does. In reality, routine, predictability, and structure, as boring as those words sound, can actually free our minds up to be completely present in a specific moment and to focus on things that truly matter. Structure allows us to make small additions and subtractions to our day for the purpose of maximizing the joy that we experience. To experience that sense of calm that we desperately want oftentimes can be found in routine. Look, I know routine may not sound super exciting, but it is an important part of a happy life, and it is an important part of a happy marriage. I'm guessing you can see where I'm going with this. The last few months have devastated our family routines. From civil unrest to pandemics, where it started, our days just look different now. Our routines have changed entirely. This is true for us on an individual level. Your work life probably looks different now than it did in February, but it's also true for marriages, which is what we're going to focus on today. How much time you spend with your spouse, what you do with that time, even what you talk about, is probably very different now than it was just a couple of months ago. Things have changed. For some marriages, that change is an opportunity because you need it. The routine you were in wasn't working. You were in a flow of tending to kids or tending to work schedules or tending to the mountain of things that we had put on our daily routines. You had been so inundated in that you had been successfully ignoring the fact that your marriage was on fire. I did classes routinely before the pandemic about how we were so overburdening our families with extracurricular stuff and outside stuff and school stuff. We were so overburdening our families that we were losing valuable time to connect. And if that's you, it's possible that your marriage had been drifting apart way before we got to this moment in time, but you've been successfully ignoring it. And now that routines have changed, you've got the ability to focus on it. If that's you this morning or this evening, whenever you're watching this, I pray that you're with me and I pray that you'll listen with an open mind. For others, the change that we've experienced in this culture is a threat because things were going really well. You were rocking right along. Then everything went haywire and you've been left with a sense of disconnection or a sense of dread or a sense of fear. And if that's you, I wonder if some of you have been feeling more anxiety than you're willing to tell your spouse. And the reason for that is because things have been going well and things have been rocking right along. And so that deep sense of dread and fear that's been eating at you and gnawing at your brain, I don't really want to stress her out, so I don't really bring it up. Or I don't want to stress him out, so I don't really bring it up. And when I do bring it up, we kind of shut it down because we don't really deal with stress very well right now. Okay, if that's you, I pray that you are with me today and that you'll listen with an open mind. And finally, for some of you, your marriages were pretty steady and they're still pretty steady, but the changes of the past few months have presented questions that you're not totally sure how to answer. The future is muddled. Where do we go from here? And if that's you, I pray that you're with me this morning. Regardless, the world has changed and no doubt your marriage has changed too. So our goal for today is to discover some ways that we can make this change work for us, to grow our marriages into the kind of connected, loving, godly marriages that only a moment like this could have produced. So with that in mind, thank you for joining me in this exploration. Now let's get rolling. So you've heard me say that this moment that we're experiencing in our marriages is unique. And so as a result of that, there are some things that we're going to discuss in terms of our marriages that are unique to the COVID world. But before we do that, there's some overarching principles of happy marriages that it would benefit us to explore before we get into kind of the COVID specific stuff. These principles were true before COVID, they're true during, and they will absolutely be true after. To point them out, I want to paint a picture for you. We have a couple that gets married. The early years are exciting, but kind of clunky. Generally speaking, that first 18 to 24 months is transitional. It's hard, and learning how to be a married couple is a challenge. But they grow, and they're trying really hard. And then kids come along at some point, and mom kind of throws herself into it with everything she's got. Everything becomes about the kids. That doesn't bother dad because it kind of becomes about the kid for him too. He gets it. For him, everything's about the kids too, but it looks different. He's not really tending to the day-to-day stuff that mom's tending to. He's throwing himself into work, into finding a bigger house, and to being able to afford nicer vacations. And he's thinking about college for his kids when they're 2 and 3 and 4. And he's thinking about that first car. He's thinking about the macro family stuff. Everybody is contributing to the family as a whole, and everyone appreciates the value that the other person's offering. But something's happening as this family grows that nobody's saying out loud. Mom and dad don't really talk to each other as much as the years progress. They talk with the family as a whole, but they don't really talk to each other as much anymore. They chat, they catch up, they talk schedules, and they talk logistics a ton. But they stop exploring each other. They stop showing a genuine interest in the other person. They have an interest in the information they can get about schedules and when to be where, but they stop showing a genuine interest in the human being that they're spending their life with. They both figure they've got the other one pretty well figured out, so they just stop asking curious questions about the other person. They assume that they know everything there is to know. So they stop asking questions about the past. They're kind of tired of hearing those stories anyway. They stop asking about their thoughts because they already kind of know them. They stop asking what movies they like and why. They stop pointing out little intricacies that make them who they are. They stop sharing some of those inside jokes that they used to share. They're a good team. They work well together, but when they get a chance to connect to each other, instead they just kind of do their own thing. He's got his hobbies and she's got hers. Nobody is outright wounded the other person, but no one has outright tried to actively love the other person either. This couple that I'm describing, this hypothetical couple that I'm describing, looks like so many of the couples that I've worked with over the years. And what they don't know is that the couple that I described is teetering on the brink of disaster. And they would be shocked to hear me say that, because it doesn't feel like disaster. But it is. And from a marriage counseling perspective, I see a lot of red flags and a lot of problems in the story that I just described. We all have needs. We need to be seen. We need to be heard. We need to be loved. We need to be valued. We need to be explored. And we need to be appreciated. We need intimacy. Sex, yes, but more than that, true intimacy. We need to belly laugh with another person. And when those things are missing, the conditions for disaster are present, despite the fact that our vision of trauma and disaster hasn't really come to fruition. So here's the first principle that I need you to hear today. To total a car, you don't have to drive it off a bridge. You just have to stop checking the oil. Most of the marital distress that I see is rooted in that concept right there. Most of it isn't crisis or trauma or two people who did horrible things to each other. Yes, that happens, certainly. Any marriage counselor will tell you we've encountered those things, and we encounter them on a fairly regular basis. But most of the marriage counseling that I do is not trauma work. It's two people who stopped tending to their marriage. The couple that I described a minute ago just stopped checking the oil in their engine, and that engine is about to die. But it's not going to die with a loud and obvious crash. It's going to die with a subtle shake as that engine finally dies, never to start again. The husband and wife in this scenario will likely start daydreaming about a different life, maybe with somebody else, but maybe just without the spouse that they've drifted away from. Maybe they'll muster up the courage to leave, but more likely they won't. And for the record, just so I've said it, the two most vulnerable times for marriage are in the first 18 to 24 months, and then within the first 2 years of the youngest child leaving home. That's another high-risk area for divorce. So again, maybe this couple, this imaginary couple that I've created, maybe they'll leave, but more than likely they won't. They'll probably stay because it's too complicated to leave. Plus, what would the kids think? What would the people at church say? No, it's easier to just stay and keep drifting apart until you barely speak to each other at all. But they'll always be bothered. Always be bothered by the thought that there was something out in the world that was better than what they have. Someone else, or maybe no one else. But getting out might have been better. You know the old saying, and it's something that is vital for us to consider in our marriages. You know the old saying that the grass is always greener on the other side? That's cliche because it rings true for a lot of people. Different circumstances look way more appealing than our current circumstances, but that brings me to principle number 2 that I need you to hear this morning, overarching principle number 2. Folks, the grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. If you want the yard of your marriage to be lush and green, you don't need a new yard. You need to water it more often. If your yard looks dead and brown, moving to a new yard just means you're going to kill that one too. If you don't know how to tend to your yard, a new yard's not going to help. You don't have to wrap a car around a tree. You don't have to drive it off a bridge to total it. You just have to stop checking the oil, and the grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. These two big picture ideas are always true of marriages, but have never been more true than they are right now in the midst of this bizarre cultural fun house mirror that we're living in today. So now let's get into the more specific type stuff. So you've heard me say to check the oil, to water the grass. Cool metaphors, right? They all sound good, but how do we do it? How do we practically do the things that I'm talking about? So now we're going to get into the really specific stuff. We did the big picture stuff. Now let's do the how-to. The do this and your marriage will benefit stuff. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do today is to process the experience of the last few months with your spouse. This has to be intentional, and it has to be out loud. And by process, I mean literally discussing it with your spouse. Again, it has to be intentional, and it has to be out loud. And when I say discuss it, processing means talking about the emotional experience, talking about the impact, talking about the roller coaster of feelings that you've had. For some, this process sounds overwhelming because you fear that saying these things out loud is going to make you feel worse. But that's not how emotions work. I'm going to try to explain this quickly because I have a lot to get to today. But when things that stress us out, or when things that scare us, when they don't get out, when we don't say them out loud, they exist in the creative hemisphere of our brain. And in that creative hemisphere, our creative brain adds to the scariness and adds to the drama and adds to the emotion. By virtue of telling a story out loud, you have to activate the concrete hemisphere of your brain. And as a result, it levels it out just a bit. So we take some of that high-level emotionality, we bring in some concrete analysis and logical sequential thought that is required to say something out loud. And by virtue of saying it out loud, the emotional experience comes down. Okay, that was like DIY therapy, and I know it was a little bit complicated, but what that means is that you have to say things out loud in order to feel better. That's kind of the simplistic version of what I'm saying. We have to say things out loud in order to decrease the emotional weight that it carries. And when we do this with our spouse, with the right attitude, it can be an incredibly bonding experience. And we're going to get back to that attitude part as we go through this. But the process of processing isn't just good therapy. It's biblical. Jesus did it. I want to show you what I mean when I say that Jesus processed emotion out loud, or he facilitated the process of processing. There is a story in Luke chapter 24 that you are probably familiar with. This is a story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus after Jesus has been crucified. I want to give you a brief picture of what's been going on with these two guys. The last couple of weeks for them have been wild, to say the least. From the triumphal entry that looked like this triumphant, I don't know what other word to use, moment all the way up to the crucifixion. And amongst the disciples, as these men in this story were, there's a theme of misunderstanding as to what Jesus came to do. Many thought, right up until the moment of his death, that he was there to establish an earthly kingdom. And this included his disciples, many of his disciples. And all of those hopes came crashing down at the death of Jesus on the cross. As of this moment, they've heard stories of Jesus' resurrection. Now, for those of you who grew up in churches, the idea of Jesus being resurrected and walking around fully human again after being executed is something that we've grown up with. That mental picture is not a challenge for us to create. For these disciples, oh, it was. They didn't grow up with felt board stories. They didn't have Miss Whoever telling them about baby Jesus in the manger. These disciples, hearing a story of Jesus, they saw him be crucified. And now having him walking around, talking to people, would have been right up to the line of inconceivable. So they are very, very confused. They're experiencing trauma, anxiety, uncertainty. Everything that they'd taken comfort in was now gone. I'm going to say that again slowly, and I want you to be thinking about the last 3 months for us. Everything they'd taken comfort in was now gone. But then Jesus shows up walking the road with them. Now, he could have done whatever he wanted. He could have showed up, he could have revealed himself, and he could have instantly healed their pain. But he doesn't. Instead, Jesus appears to them in verse 15 of this passage, and we're told that he hides who he is. And then for 16 verses, a trip that included about 7 miles of walking and then stopping to prepare a meal, Jesus hides who he is and instead simply talks to these disciples. He teaches, yes, but he doesn't start with that. He starts by asking them to tell him the story of their hurt. He asks them, why are you so sad? And then when they give him a little bit of information about why they're sad, he then says, tell me more. What Jesus is doing in this moment is an awful lot like what we're describing in terms of processing. And for the purposes of our conversation this morning, I simply want to point out that processing pain out loud, giving words to your struggle is vital. Again, in that story of the road to Emmaus for 16 verses, Jesus is allowing these disciples to process their pain, knowing full well if he revealed himself at any moment, he could stop that pain. But he allows the pain to continue. And I think, and granted it's just my speculation, I think that this story talks to us, speaks to us about the value in processing things out loud. Okay, so the question is, if we're going to process things out loud, what does processing look like in a marriage? That is a great question. But here's the thing. I don't want to saturate your marriage with negativity. So we're going to talk about structuring processing within your marriage in a way that kind of buffers the negative emotion as well as the positive emotion. So stay with me. I think this will make more sense as we get into it. So processing is essentially talking through emotion with the purpose or with the goal in mind of working our way through it. It's not often that people need to process happy emotions. I have yet to get a phone call of somebody who's telling me that some amazing thing happened to me and they need to come to my office to process the emotions attached to this incredible thing that happened to them so that they can figure it out. It's usually the negative emotions that we're helping people process. The problem is many marriages are reluctant to bring that kind of negativity into the marriage, and I completely understand that. And as I mentioned, I don't want to saturate your marriage with negativity. If you've ever been somebody's go-to for venting, so if anybody ever like confided something negative in you, and then you somehow got signed up to be this person's all-the-time support system, you know you get to a point, you're not going to admit it, it's fine, I'll say it, you don't have to, where you kind of dread seeing their number or their name on your phone, and you're like, I just wanted to watch a movie. I don't know if I have time for this or the emotional energy for this. And so you get to a point where you don't have super positive feelings when this person enters your existence and enters your vision. I don't want you to feel that way about your spouse. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by the negative sentiment. So I want to structure processing in your relationship out to prevent that from happening. So I'm going to give you an assignment that hopefully will serve this purpose. I'm actually technically going to give you two, but let's start with the first one. I'm going to assign you a 10-minute venting session once a day for as long as necessary, and then it can spread out to maybe once every couple of days after that. What is a 10-minute venting session? That means for 10 minutes, you talk, you go, you let all that stuff out that you have been carrying around with you while your spouse simply listens and supports. And I'll get to that in just a second. But what does the venting part look like? Unload, man. Talk about the kids. Talk about COVID. Talk about how the culture is in crisis. Talk about how your job's unstable. Talk about how there's no sports on TV to distract us. Talk about how you got a family member who's handling this whole pandemic thing totally different than you, which is fine, but she's being super judgy about it. And she's putting a bunch of like subtle stuff on social media. Doesn't have your name on it. She's not tagging you in it, but you kind of know that's what she's talking about. You can vent all of those things out in your 10-minute venting session. Unload, vent. I generally in sessions, I call these vomit sessions. It's a little crass, so I wasn't going to include it in the video. Not really sure why I did. But the idea here is for 10 minutes, you vent and you unload and you explore. Now, if you're worried about that from your spouse, if you think, I don't want to be underneath that avalanche, one, you're probably a husband. And two, we've got a solution for that. Your job in this moment and what's going to make this effective and what's going to make this really impactful for your spouse is that you don't have to fix anything. You don't have to solve any problems. And for the record, you don't need to offer any insight. We'll go back to that in just a second. Just for 10 minutes, go nuts, purge, and then you switch sides. And the other person does the same thing. Now, when you are talking, your job is to dig deep. I don't want you to say like, I don't know. Everything's fine, I guess. You know, it's a little hot. Really and truly, try to think through. We've all been stressed. We've all struggled. Dig through some of those negative emotions so that you can process them out loud. When you are listening, your job is simply to reflect the emotion that you see. You are forbidden from offering advice or a counterpoint unless your spouse specifically asks for it. Men, I'm going to give you a tool that will serve you well for the best of your marriage, for the rest of your marriage, not the best of your marriage, will serve you well for the rest of your marriage if you can get a handle on it. Reflect the emotion that you see in your wife. That's it. You don't have to know what she's talking about or what to do about it. But if you can see that she's angry, reflect anger. If you can see that she's frustrated, reflect frustration. Let her know that you understand. If she's venting to you about something that upset her, if she can see that like, wow, yeah, that is crazy, and you're joining her in that emotion, that is going to be so much more valuable than if you give her the right advice. Reflecting the emotion that your wife is experiencing makes her feel heard. And it makes her feel understood. If she's angry, it's not that hard to get angry with her. If she's mad at a conversation she had earlier, you can kind of join her like, yeah, that's crazy. If she's scared, being able to say, yeah, oh, I understand. I understand. It does look scary right now. And giving her the ability to see you reflecting emotion. That's, I promise you, husbands, she wants that so much more than she wants the answer. Now, there may be times where she wants your opinion too, but she always wants the emotion. So start with that and then worry about the instructional part if she asks for it. Just to be clear about venting sessions. Venting sessions are intentional moments of processing negative emotion with your spouse for the purpose of bonding. You can still be frustrated outside of your venting session. I'm not limiting your negative emotions to one 10-minute window. We're just creating an intentional 10-minute window for them to go into. Don't use venting sessions as an excuse to not let your spouse be stressed at other times. What I mean by that is if in the middle of the day she finds something else to be stressed about or he finds something else to be stressed about, don't forbid that because you're not in a venting session. Venting sessions are a good way to process the struggle that we're all in right now. But just as important as venting is being intentional about seeing the good. So let's talk about focusing on the positive for just a minute. Here's my clinical opinion on the key difference between happy people and unhappy people. The key difference is oftentimes what they choose to focus on in their day and in their life. Super happy people aren't generally that way because life is just working out perfectly. Now, I'm not saying circumstances don't affect the way we feel, but they're not usually, at least in my experience, the key difference between happy and unhappy people. I've seen countless times where unhappy people have an amazing ability to be unhappy anywhere, under any circumstances. These are the people who can be unhappy because the seat on their Disney World ride is not as comfortable as they would like. Circumstances have very little to do with our happiness. To avoid this, we have to be intentional about focusing on the good in our lives. So in addition to venting sessions, which we talked about a moment ago, I want to encourage awesome sessions too. So what is an awesome session? It is exactly what it sounds like. It's the same basic structure where you give each other 10 minutes to talk about the awesome things going on in your life and in the world around you. Try to be sure that you include day-to-day stuff in this practice. I say that because I know people and I know couples and relationships pretty well. The first time you do an awesome session, if it's not something that's in your normal routine, you're probably going to talk about macro stuff. Well, we got really good kids. I love our kids. You're a really good mom. That's our favorite compliment. We're going to go to the big picture. I got a good life. I'm generally pretty happy. I got it, but don't just say we've got great kids over and over and over. Talk about the little things you see throughout the course of your day. And if you struggle with this, if you struggle to get into the micro, the little tiny moments that you see during the day, there's another assignment that I've used for years that is really super effective for helping in this. And that is, I have oftentimes assigned individual clients an awesome journal. I use that word just because it's easy to remember. I realize it's not super clinical, but I'm the one talking, so stay with me. An awesome journal, what it allows people to do is I ask people to write for 5 minutes at a time. It's a free writing exercise. For 5 minutes at a time, once a day. All the things that you're good at, all the blessings in your life, all the positive, good things going on around you. But here's the rule. In a given week, you can't write the same thing twice. Now, the reason that's big is because the first day, 5 minutes, no problem. You can fill 5 minutes worth of stuff when you start thinking about it. By day 3 or day 4, you're left with really 2 choices. One, stare blankly at that page and try to figure out what to write. Or number 2, you'll start to notice that during the day, you're identifying good things in a way that you didn't previously, because you know that you have to talk about them and you have to write about them. So I say that because if you're having a hard time focusing on some of those micro blessings and micro things, that awesome journal might be a good thing for you to do. A blessings journal is another good idea. My family, and I meant to have it with me, my family has we have a small little book. It's like a 3x5 bound book that sits in a specific spot on our end table in our living room. That is our blessings journal. Anytime something good pops in your head that you want to remember or something that you're grateful for, we put it in the blessings journal. And on bad days, it is a lot of fun to pick up that blessings journal and to read some of the amazing things that God has done in our lives and has done in our families. All right, so let's go back to awesome sessions. There is a weird thing about our psychology. We tend to like people more when they elicit positive emotions from us. In other words, if all we do is vent and complain to people, we'll want to avoid that person. So if we have somebody in our lives who is just a complainer, we will want to avoid that person. Awesome sessions with your spouse will make you like your spouse more. And I'm not making that up. And you may discover that they notice more good things about you and about your life that you give them credit for. You may be married to somebody right now who you think is always in a bad mood and always negative. Man, try some awesome sessions. Listen to that person talk about all the good things they do see in your life and the good things they do see in your marriage. I think you may be surprised at how much is actually there. Eventually, you'll probably stop doing awesome sessions. You probably are not going to, this is not going to be part of your daily routine. But my prayer is that in your tendencies to see the positive in your life, that tendency never fades. My prayer is that in moments where you're overwhelmed with negativity, that this practice of awesome sessions never ends. That blessings journal that I mentioned is a phenomenal way to do this. So our first takeaway today, our first action item was to process the experience together. And we do this using negative emotion through a venting session, positive emotion through an awesome session. You're having a lot of conversation about negative and positive emotions that in your marriage you may not have had previously. So that was our first takeaway. We do this just like Jesus did with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. So let's get into our second takeaway. So our second takeaway today is to be careful with your thumbs. I have a journaling Bible that I use. It's what I take to church with me, and it's what I use for my personal study. The unique thing about my journaling Bible is the columns, in a journaling Bible, on the columns in each page is a section for notes, for journaling. My journaling Bible is not for me. My journaling Bible is for my sons. And every passage I highlight and every note that I write is specifically for them. They're very little. They're 8 and 4. And so there's already a whole bunch of stuff for them that we'll add to as they grow. There's one particular scripture that I highlighted for them that probably has the most extensive note for them in my Bible. And that passage is Proverbs 4:23. And it reads like this: "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Guard your heart. That's an important concept for us as Christians. It's an important concept for us as married individuals. How do we guard our heart, though? You know the pathway to your heart? It's your eyes, it's your ears, and in this culture, it's your thumbs. Our thumbs create problems for us. When we started this conversation, I mentioned a little about my clinical background, but there's something I didn't include, and that is I wrote my dissertation for my PhD. I wrote my dissertation on the impact of social media on marriages and families. I could do a multi-hour presentation on that, but for now, I'll just say this. Social media is interfering with the way that our families function, and it's interfering with the way that our families feel. That was true before the pandemic, but now, as things have changed, be it the pandemic or the civil unrest we've had lately, we are consuming media and consuming our phones more than we ever have. Stuff's weird. We're not just checking sports scores now. There aren't really any sports scores to check. Now, things are happening every day that are bizarre. And we're looking relentlessly to see what's happening, or to see somebody else's thoughts about it, or just because we've been stuck at home for a really long time and we're using our phones to connect to the outside world. We're using our digital media now more than ever before. My screen time thing on my iPhone that every Sunday gives me a report of how much screen time I spent every day. For the last couple of weeks, it's been popping up, and instead of giving me minutes, it's just like, everything okay at home? Do we need to talk? Like, my screen time is worried about me because I've been on my phone a lot more lately than I normally have. And I professionally have an interest in monitoring that and how much time I spend. But it's impossible for us right now in this culture to not dive into our phones. I want you to know something. Everything digitally has been polarized. I'll remind you, it is an election year, but that's kind of true anyway. Stuff digitally gets polarized because that's how things get attention. What we see online is never measured or rational or balanced. And if we do, that's not usually the stuff that people are pointing us to. It's polarized because it's meant to elicit emotion. Because if it can do that, you'll go back to it. Facebook was designed to make you feel emotions. That's what keeps you there. And the easiest, most accessible emotion is anger and fear. Those two things go hand in hand, so there's lots of it online. But even if the media that you consume makes you feel better. So if you say to me like, well, yeah, I know there's a lot of hate out there, but I've really worked hard to curate my digital presence to be optimistic and positive. That's awesome. Good for you. But even if the feelings you get from your phone are positive and good, I would rather you get those feelings from a person. I would rather you get them from a prayer or from a devotional. I would rather you get them in a place that is sustainable, not from a social media feed. So I'm going to say this as simply as I can. Intentionally limit the amount of time that you spend looking at your phone. Do the same with news and TV, by the way. What you see at noon is pretty much the same thing you're going to see at 8. You don't need to consume it to the point that it affects you emotionally. So if you spend a lot of time on Facebook or you spend a lot of time on some other social media platform, now is the time to cut that time in half. I challenge you today to do that. Cut your phone time in half. And if you can't do that, by the way, maybe that speaks to the root of the problem. But I want to challenge you this morning to cut that screen time in half. By the way, that's probably what most of you heard when I started talking about thumbs. You heard me talking about social media. Yeah, I believe that social media is getting in the way of our marriages, but I also believe that less time with news media right now is a good thing as well. I'm going to give you an important example of what I mean. Men in our culture right now are paying more attention to what's happening in the world than we ever have previously. We're watching news more than we ever have. We're reading it more than we ever have. We have strong emotions and strong opinions about the things that we're seeing. Now, if you want to include those things in your venting session, awesome. Go ahead. If that is the root of your venting session, man, let it out. But outside of that session, don't bombard your wife with the daily cultural play-by-play of things that make you mad. That is a really important thing to do. I've struggled with that myself, and it was my own wife who had to tell me, hey, I love you, but you got to stop talking to me about some of this stuff. And so I want to pass her advice on to you. We don't need to bombard the people we love with negative emotions. In Ephesians 5, the Apostle Paul gives his family codes for Christian families. He describes men as the head of the household. This is true for us spiritually, but I also think it's true for us emotionally, which I know sounds weird, but there's something that I've noticed. Every man believes that the emotional atmosphere in his home is dictated by his wife. While the wives that I've worked with will report to me universally that their emotional conditions are generally a response to the husband. In other words, if your home is unhappy, men, if your home is tense, if your home is stressful, try being the one to change that atmosphere by changing the emotions that you bring into it. It is amazing to me how often our families, men, our families will respond to our emotional cues But we don't know that, and we don't recognize that we have that ability. So we just blame the fact that our wife is in a bad mood for why the house is all tension and stress filled. Try being the emotion that you want in your home. I think you'll be amazed at what good that can do for your marriage. It also means being careful how much anger, stress, and negativity and fear you bring into your home through your media consumption. So that's our second takeaway. Let's go to our third. My third piece of advice to you, my third go-to move for thriving in your marriage during COVID is to explore your spouse. We are really good at this for a while, but at a certain point, we just kind of stop exploring our spouse. That's when the emotion in the marriage tends to stagnate. The marriage that I presented to you in the beginning, where I described that hypothetical marriage, kind of fits this description. I can't say this any more clearly. Never stop exploring your spouse. Because here's the thing. He or she will always feel good about you if you continually explore who they are. And also, they change. You've heard it before. Maybe you've said it before. You're not the man that I married. Yeah, that's 100% true. That's expected, and that's totally normal. If you've been married for 10 years and you're still the same person you were when you got married, something is horribly wrong in your relationship. Yes, the idea that we change and the idea that we grow is a given, and it's a normal, natural part of a marriage. The problem isn't that your spouse has changed. It's that they changed independent of you, and you changed independent of them. Change is inevitable, but for it to be healthy, you need change together. So how do we do this? It's incredibly simple, and this moment in our time, in this pandemic, this cultural moment, has given us the perfect opportunity to do this because we're getting more face-to-face time with our spouses than we ever had. So how do we do it? It's incredibly simple. You ask each other questions that are different than the ones you normally ask each other. You ask each other exploratory questions. To give you an idea of what I mean, I don't want to just leave you with, okay, I'm supposed to ask exploratory questions. Does your foot hurt? I mean, that's kind of exploratory, right? I don't know. I don't want to leave you having to figure this out on your own. So, along with this conversation, I included a PDF. And that PDF is a bunch of questions that you can go through with your spouse. There is weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks worth of different things for you to talk about that will allow you to grow. It'll allow you to build a deeper understanding of who your partner is. And it will allow you to start to figure out what exploring your spouse looks like. And in the midst of a pandemic where you're getting more face-to-face time with each other, I cannot stress how significant and how important it is for you to not get stuck in the routine of only talking about logistics or about work or about bills or about kids. The day-to-day stuff in your life, look, I know it needs to be explored, needs to be discussed. But please, I'm begging you, in the midst of this moment, explore your spouse. Let those questions that I provided be the guide for that. If you go through just a couple of them a day, I don't need to go through a bunch of them. Pick 2 or 3. Go through a couple of those questions a day and really genuinely try to talk. Try to engage. Don't give one-sentence answers. Try to go really far into the conversation. I promise you, it is impossible to go through questions like the ones that I provided for you and not learn more about who your spouse is, and to not walk away with your spouse feeling more connected to you and you feeling more connected to your spouse. So that's my third takeaway, but we got one more. My last takeaway today is not specific to the COVID situation that we are in, but is probably as applicable now, if not more so than it ever has been. Our last takeaway today is simple. Be patient. Stress is high. Emotions are on the surface. Be patient with your spouse when they drop the ball. Be patient with your kids when they drive you nuts. Keep in mind, their world has been completely upended too, but they have a fraction of the emotional processing capacity that you have. When kids can't process emotions, they act out. They say rude stuff. Be patient with them. If you are struggling with this, ask your spouse for help. If you are struggling to find patience within you, ask your spouse for help and support each other in that request. Maybe the best thing in the world for you would be to get away for a couple hours, to decompress for a bit, to get some quiet time, some alone time, doing something that you personally enjoy. Husbands, if your wife needs that, recognize it. Don't judge it. Don't belittle it. Work hard to give that to her. Wives, if you recognize this in your husband, don't judge it. Don't belittle it. Work hard to give your husband this gift. Find small moments of peace for yourself in the midst of this crisis. But just as importantly, I want to challenge you today to look for small moments of peace to give to your spouse. Moments that you can hand your spouse and say, hey, this is for you to enjoy. Take a couple hours, take a moment, take a nap. And if you're the mother or father of young kids, that may be exactly what you want to do. But here, go and have this. You'll be amazed at what exercising that type of patience can do for the feeling within your marriage. And there's something about patience that I want to make sure that I've said before our exploration is over. In Mark chapter 5, there's a little story that takes place between verses 21 and 43. I'm going to just make a quick reference of. It's a powerful reminder of why we need to trust God's timing and the value of exercising patience. Jesus has just stepped off the boat from healing a demon-possessed man. This is right after the calming of the storm. Jesus stepped off the boat, and Jairus, who is a ruler of the synagogue, meets him and he falls at his feet. Jairus' daughter is dying. Jairus knows that Jesus is the only one in the world who can save his daughter, and he knows because she's dying that time is of the essence. Many of us in this culture right now feel the same way about our world. Time is of the essence. We feel like Jesus is the only one who can save us, and time is of the essence. So Jesus looks at Jairus, he sees his pain, he connects with the hurt that he sees in Jairus, and he agrees to go and heal Jairus' daughter. I can't imagine how amazing that would have felt. This was it. This was the answer to Jairus' prayers, the answer to all of his problems. Jesus, the healer, heard him and was coming to save the day. But then something happens. In verse 25 of this passage, we're introduced to a woman who, frankly, has nothing to do with Jairus and has nothing to do with the story itself. We're given her backstory. And then in verse 27, she touches Jesus' robe so that she can be healed. And then Jesus turns and talks to her. And then they have a whole big, extensive conversation that takes up the next 8 verses. In the middle of their conversation, somebody runs up to Jairus and says, your daughter is dead. There's no need to trouble Jesus any further. I can't imagine Jairus' heartbreak in that moment, the devastation of this news. He'd been so close. But Jesus had missed the window of time that Jairus' human brain had put on him, and now it's over. Jesus looks at him and says something to him that in our moments where we struggle with patience, and in our moments where we need divine intervention in our lives and in our marriages, he says something to him that is profound. He says, do not fear, only believe. And at that, he goes to the little girl who is now dead and lovingly, tenderly says to the little girl, sweetie, get up. And she's resurrected. Okay, so this went, and we talked about patience. This went from a healing to a resurrection. It went from amazing to unspeakable. Not in spite of the fact that it took longer than Jairus wanted, but specifically because of that fact. Precisely because of the delay in Jesus' intervention in this man's life and in this little girl's death, Jairus got more than he could have ever bargained for, could have ever asked for. He came to have his daughter healed, but he got so much more than that. He came for a cure, and he got a resurrection. Okay, so I understand that it seems like we may have just jumped outside of where we normally have been in this conversation, but I want to tie this moment back to our marriages. Patience means the same thing in our marriages that it can mean for our culture as a whole, which is God doesn't work on our timetables. And so if you're praying for healing in your marriage, or if you're praying for patience in your marriage, continue to exercise it to the best of your ability. And I think you can see when the story is over and when we get through these moments, we can see the hand of God way more clearly in hindsight. So to tie this whole thing again back to our marriages, if you're feeling overwhelmed today, be patient. If you're worried that the outside world is dying, be patient. We may get a healing, we may get a resurrection. If you're struggling with your kids today, be patient. If you're struggling with your spouse today, be patient. Recognize nobody has a script for what to do in the midst of this type of a moment. So be patient and bond sometimes over the experience of the fact that you're losing your patience. I know it sounds odd that you can bond over that, but you absolutely can bond over that. My wife and I have had many moments where we've bonded over the fact that we have less patience with our kids right now than we may have had in a different time when we were leaving the house from time to time. So exercise patience with each other. If your marriage is in a good place, great, wonderful. Continue to grow together, but be patient in that process. If your marriage is dead, you may feel like Jairus. That this is all what we've been talking about today. This is all well and good, and it's all nice for somebody else, but it's too late for us. It's over. The feelings are gone. If that is you, my prayer for you today is that there's not a healing in your marriage, that there's a resurrection in your marriage. But regardless of where you are today, if you can do the things that we've discussed, do the things that we've explored today, I think you'll be amazed at the impact that it can have on your marriage. I haven't given you any magic formula. I don't have that in my bag of tricks anywhere. I don't have some magic spell that's going to make your marriage perfect and going to make your spouse the perfect spouse. But what we've walked away with today is 4 to-dos and 1 overarching principle, 2 overarching principles technically. If you can exercise these 4 things, be intentional about processing the experience that we're under with your spouse. The positive, the negative, venting sessions, awesome sessions where you're talking with intentionality about the emotion that you're experiencing right now. You'll be amazed at what it can do for your marriage. If you will watch your thumbs, which means be cautious with the amount of time you spend looking at a screen and what you're looking at. If you can watch your thumbs in this moment, I think you'll be amazed at what it can do for your marriage. If you will explore your spouse, ask questions about their existence and their dreams and their past and their present and their thoughts and their feelings and all those things that you used to ask. If you'll go back to that, to exploring your spouse, you'll be amazed at what it can do for your marriage. And if you will be patient with each other and patient with God, I mean this, I'm way better at being patient with my wife right now than I am being patient with God. I am struggling with, come on, we've got to get back to churches. We've got to get back to some semblance of normal. My heart breaks for you if you agree with that or if you feel that way, but be patient. We may be in store for a healing. We may be in store for a resurrection, but I believe that God is in control. I think that you will find, if you can do those 4 things, and if you can remember that the grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. And begin today using those 4 things that we just unpacked to begin watering your marriage in a way that you've never watered it previously. You'll be checking the oil, which is the other thing we talked about. You'll be giving into your marriage, breathing into your marriage, working hard to make your marriage something better than what it is today. And if you can do that, I think you'll be amazed at what God can do for your marriage. I want to leave you with this. You will have the marriage that you choose to work for. I'm going to say that again. You will have the marriage that you work for. So be intentional. Put in an effort. Remember, nobody ever accidentally had a great marriage. So if you want one, it's going to take some effort and some intentionality. I want to challenge you today to begin making the marriage that you have always wanted. I thank you for spending this time with me. And I pray for your marriages. And I pray for you as you begin today making the marriage that you've always wanted. Hi, this is Dr. Ryan. You are listening to this hopefully because you just listened to a presentation entitled Nurturing Your Marriage During COVID. This PDF is meant to support that conversation. You will remember in that conversation, I covered a section called Exploring Your Spouse. What I meant by that was talk about things that are outside of your norm. If you've been married more than a few minutes, you can relate to the experience of sitting on the couch, looking at your partner and really wanting something to talk about that's not kids or work schedules or politics or the basic routine stuff that we tend to discuss with our spouses. This PDF is meant to support that very conversation. You're really going to find 2 levels of conversation in it. You're going to begin with some questions that are meant to be fun and entertaining. And for the record, if any of these questions spark conflict, bail. don't continue down a road that's conflict laden. This is meant to be an enjoyable activity where you and your spouse get to know each other better. Once you've made it through those fun questions at the beginning, the second section gets a little more serious and gets a little bit deeper, although there's nothing too incredibly intense. But it's gonna have you and your spouse going through a level of dialogue that's meant to actually create intimacy, that's meant to build trust. The goal of this exercise is not just to give you something to do. The goal of this exercise is to give you the ability to get to know your partner in a way that you could have never known them otherwise. And it's also meant to give you a way to get out of your rut, out of your dialogue rut. So if you can relate to that experience, and if you are married, again, for more than a few minutes, I know you can, spend some time with this activity. Here's my last note for you. Take your time. This is not a race. You're not trying to get through these questions quickly. In all honesty, you could probably spend 6 to 8 months going through these questions. Go slowly. Don't do 5 or 6 at a time. Just do 1 or 2 at a time. And then maybe you don't talk about them for a couple of days and then you go back. Don't be in a hurry. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is push yourself in terms of how much you say. In other words, 1 or 2 sentences is not enough to really benefit from this exercise. If you want to grow from this exercise, I would encourage you to push yourself to answer these questions in as much depth and as much detail as possible. And if you can do that, I think you will be amazed at how much this activity can push the intimacy within your marriage. So again, these questions are meant to be fun. Enjoy it. Don't spend too much time in the negativity. Have fun. Enjoy the experience, explore your spouse, build your intimacy, and grow your marriage at a time when I know that's really hard.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Samira Page, and I'm the Vicar of Holy Nativity Episcopal Church in Plano and Grace Community Farsi-speaking church. And I'm also the Executive Director of Gateway of Grace Ministries in Dallas. Life is full, and the challenges of COVID-19 have added so much stress to our daily lives. The simplest of things like grocery shopping has become so stressful and so difficult. On top of all these daily challenges that I face with my ministry and with COVID-19, I also work with my husband. He is my ministry partner, and for the past several months, we have been inseparable. We have been stuck together. And it's sweet in some ways and challenging in other ways. I know many of you may be experiencing financial difficulties and challenges and the stress of losing a job. So all of that is there. And these are realities of our lives today. I was thinking about Ephesians chapter 5, in that Paul is calling all of us to a holy life through love and mutual submission. And in that, he calls husbands and wives to a deeper kind of mutual love and submission. It's a beautiful kind of mutual love and submission that is so much deeper and so much more powerful. What is significant about this passage is that Paul doesn't say, well, whenever everything is okay, whenever the world is perfect, then you love one another and submit to one another. No, it's in this messy world with all of its struggles and difficulties that we are called to this kind of relationship, to this kind of mutual love and submission relationship. And you may say, well, I can't do it. I am just tired. I'm exhausted. I've had it and it's enough. I can't do it. And you're right. I couldn't do it had I been left to my own devices either. But the fact is that you are not alone. You are not alone, not because my husband and I are facing the same things, not because millions of other couples in the world are facing the same things, the same issues, the same kind of struggles. You are not alone because God is right there with you. Your marriage is between you, your spouse, and God. And whenever you're frustrated, you feel like you can't take it anymore, God is there to take it, to handle it for you. And you have to trust him. Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and tired, and I will give you rest. Trust him. He is inviting you. He is knocking. And if you open the door and open your heart and really and truly trust him, right in the midst of your struggles, and say, okay, Jesus, I am giving you this situation. I can't handle it, but I know you can. And you really believe that God will take care of that. I see it in my own life every day, and I see it in the lives of so many people who are experiencing God's love and God's peace in the midst of difficult situations and challenges. If you haven't given your heart to Jesus, or if you have, but right now you feel so far from God, just open your heart and say a simple prayer and ask Jesus to enter your heart and to give you his peace and his rest. It works. It works. What do you have to lose? Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you for attending our speaker series, Supporting Families Through COVID-19, presented by Episcopal Family Ministry. Join us for a question and answer session via Zoom with the speaker this Thursday at 6 p.m., Friday at 8:30 p.m., or Saturday at 9:30 a.m. Please register for these calls with the link provided. The Episcopal Churches of Collin County are praying for you and your families.